Drew here, and Season 2, Episode 5 of For All Mankind takes its title, The Wait, from a song by Canadian-American group The Band that has been listed by Rolling Stone as one of the most influential songs in the whole history of rock and roll, and it had, a lot of influence on other songs. And it appears in this episode during this montage that kind of speaks to the episode's themes. I think that the weight that is being referred to is the pressure that one feels from the isolation of being in space. And we see it this episode during this montage as we see both the Stevens characters. We see Tracy actually on the moon base dealing with this emptiness, as she describes it, and dealing with this isolation. Not very well, not doing much better than her husband did last season. And we see simultaneously Gordo back on Earth, training to go back to the moon and struggling again with the feelings of concern and fear that he dealt with in the past, and wondering whether he'll be able to overcome them as he returns to the moon. And I think this was a pretty good montage. I thought that the parallel being drawn between these two characters' situations was pretty well done, and I liked the music choice. It was well cut and engaging. Overall, The Wait was a pretty good, if not revelatory, episode of For All Mankind. I think that the weight of the title took up a good chunk of the episode as we saw the Stevens dealing with their fear of isolation in space. I felt that in particularly Tracy's plotline, as we got to see the moon base explored a little bit more in detail, got to see it laid out for us in a scene that was kind of expositional but still fairly interesting. I'm sure this is why a lot of people watch this show, is to see the space technology and to see what a moon base that was functioning might look like. And this was pretty interesting in that regard, even if, from a narrative standpoint, it didn't necessarily cover that much ground. I felt that it was an interesting decision to have this episode start with this sequence where Tracy is doing this promo where we see her, landing on the moon, and they have the swelling musical score, and then the camera person says, "Oops, I wasn't recording," essentially, putting a kibosh on the moment. And it was interesting because they essentially show us the moment again, and they play the same score over again. And I feel like this was an interesting decision because it kind of shows how the effect of the moon that they're concocting for the American public is the same effect the show is kind of giving to the audience, and it kind of calls into question the authenticity of it, so to speak. We got to see a little bit more of Molly in her new role, taking over for Ed as the person in charge of astronauts this episode, and the follow-up to Ed's crash into the ocean last episode. And I feel that I kind of criticized this show a little bit unfairly last week for him returning so quickly and so easily to, his goal to go to space once more. And again, I feel like this did feel a little bit rushed last week, but I feel that the show simply wanted to get Ed back into the action, and they are going to grapple with what this means for Shantel VanSanten's Karen as the season progresses, and we see more of this episode. I feel really bad for Kelly Baldwin. Her parents are constantly grieving the loss of the child that came before her. Her father had a very, very bad reaction to her wanting to join Annapolis, and it seems as though her mother is about to embark on an affair with Danny Stevens. Some people picked up on that last week. I didn't, but this episode I very, very much picked up on it. It seems like pretty clear that that's where this is headed. If it's not, and if this relationship is just innocent and it's just her bonding with him over the loss of Shane, then I'll feel bad for saying this, but it really seems like the distance between her and Ed, as we see, during this awkward dinner where he comes in and she leaves almost immediately, kind of paralleling the scene in the first episode where they were eating as a family, but this time, both Kelly and Karen leave Ed. And it's interesting because, that moment in the first episode was a sign of the unity that they had as a family, and that was before Ed decided to return to space. And he's believed all this time that he couldn't go back to space, that if he did it, it would be bad for the family unit. And it seems as though what he thought would happen is happening. And it's going to be interesting to see if Karen can learn to deal with this, or if the distance between her and Ed is going to drive her into the arms of Danny Stevens. This is really, really awkward, and as I said, I feel bad for Kelly because she's really, really going through a lot of awkward stuff with her parents already, and this is just going to add to that. Ugh. This episode also showed Lena coming to Mission Command for the first time, meeting some of the people she's going to be working with, and just getting a tour of the area. I did think that the moment where she showed her enthusiasm at being brought in to NASA to work here, I feel like that was one of the most, and maybe the only, likable moments I've seen from the character so far. She's kind of not come across too well a lot of the time. She kind of comes off as an ungrateful grump, but that moment I think made me want to like her character a bit more. I feel that having this sequence in this episode, in the same episode where we already had kind of had an expositional tour of the moon base, I feel like it's a little bit too much exposition for one episode, especially since there was another scene where Molly was talking to the astronauts who are going to the moon about what the rules of engagement are going to be and when they're going to be allowed to confront the Russians with these weapons that they're taking to the moon, these M16s. And I do feel that all these three scenes being in this episode, it felt a little bit of an exposition heavy episode. I feel like they could have broken these scenes down and had them appear in different episodes so it didn't feel like too much exposition in one episode, but that's just my opinion. Like I said, I feel that the Stevens family really had the highlights of this episode. I felt like Danny's scene with Karen where he talks about Shane and how that impacted his life, I thought that was a touching moment. I also thought that, on the moon, we got to see some very, very good acting from Sarah Jones as she has to portray this character's increased sense of isolation. And I think it's telling that continually this season we have seen this character look back to her relationship with her family and to Gordo with longing. And this episode, she kind of has to grapple both with what her role in NASA has meant to other people as she meets this young astronaut who says he was inspired by her as when she rescued another astronaut during her training, and that was part of what led him to want to become an astronaut himself. I feel that it's interesting this episode. You see what a loose cannon she has become in many regards, that she can't sleep, she's dealing with insomnia, that she is getting drunk, and just basically not being a responsible and reliable member of this moon base. And it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out because she has 5 more months to go on the moon base and how she'll hold up during the rest of that time. She's skating on thin ice. Obviously, her supervisor called her to task for it. And all the characters in this show, I feel like it's a little bit repetitive that there's so many characters in this show that aren't really doing what they should be as far as being an astronaut goes. And I have to wonder if this was really the case with astronauts during, the space race, how effective, these astronauts would be able to be. I mean, I don't really know enough about them all to say as individuals, but I certainly feel that it seems a stretch that there would be so many astronauts dealing with personal issues and, basically not really following orders or really being able to rein in some of their worst habits. It's hard for me to imagine that NASA would be an effective organization if this was the case. I thought that Tracy's monologue when she talked to Deke, or to the monument to Deke that has been erected on the moon in his honor, I felt that this scene was one of the emotional highlights of the episode. I felt that listening to her kind of unburden her emotions to essentially the memory of her friend. I felt like this was a strong moment. And again, I feel that Sarah Jones' performance was quite good here. I also thought that the moment between Gordo and his sons on Earth as they find him, under the water in the swimming pool, using his equipment to kind of experience what it's like to be breathing through this regulator. I felt that this scene where he talks to them and it, opens up to them about the fear that he's experiencing. I think that a lot of you have pointed out that Gordo seems to be this character who, despite a lot of his personal issues, has really kind of adjusted well and is finally, able to be honest about his struggles. And I think that the show, has constantly portrayed his therapy and his willingness to admit that he has problems as an asset of this character. And here I thought it was very brave of him to admit his fears to his sons. And I thought the show did a nice job of showing how, instead of, making this something that creates more shame in him, it actually helps him to cope with his issues. I think that Michael Dorman's performance has been essential to making this arc register for the audience. And I think that, just the fact that the actor did the work by gaining all this weight and allowing himself to be out of shape so that he could convincingly play someone who's kind of lost his edge, I think that that really has gone a long way to making this arc work. So overall, really enjoyed this episode, The Wait. Looking forward to next week. But let me know what you thought in the comments. If you're interested in seeing upcoming reviews on this channel, please consider subscribing. And as always, thanks for watching.